Now let's take a look at some of the events that led to the end of World War I, as well as some of the policies that came about after the war. We'll talk about the Versailles Treaty that ended the war itself, okay? So as the war is coming to an end, 1918, something pretty significant happens. Remember, Russia was a part of the Allies with France and Britain and the United States once the US gets involved. But Russia is eventually going to pull out of the war. Okay, why? Because there's political turmoil at home, and actually a revolution occurs. The communists, led by Vladimir Lenin, are going to overthrow the provisional government in Russia. Russia had already undergone a regime change earlier during the war, where the Tsar was taken out of power and a provisional government took over Russia, and it was going to be a democratic government, and everything was looking great from the perspective of Western Europe and the US. But everything changes when the communists take over Russia. Communist revolution occurs in 1918, and Lenin decides to pull out of the war. He even reveals secret treaties that were signed amongst the Allies. The Allies were talking amongst themselves, planning about what they're going to do after the war when they win the war. All right, we're going to break up Germany. You get this country, you get this country. And when he releases those secret treaties, it just totally makes the Allies look pretty bad, especially Wilson, because President Wilson was saying how, America was getting involved in the war for, moral reasons, and we're all about moral justice and democracy, but yet you have these secret plans coming out. So yeah, so Lenin pulls out of the war in a big way, and so that kind of changes things a little bit, but still the Allies are on their path to winning the war. But before we talk about the end of the war, let's talk a little bit more about the Russian Revolution and the repercussions in the United States that it had. So after the war, 1919, for a little period there, you have a period known as the Red Scare, right? And so you have a large number of strikes occurring in 1919, right? Workers are going on strike, and they're trying to fight for better pay, better working conditions, minimum wage, etc., right? But a lot of these workers who are going on strikes, the unions, there's communists within these unions, or at least they're interested in communist ideology. They're socialists as well. And so there's this period after World War I where officials are starting to believe that communist agents are behind these strikes and they're trying to destroy the American economy. Uh-oh, is there going to be a communist revolution in the US? Everyone's scared, right? And so the Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer, is going to conduct several raids, right? And a young J. Edgar Hoover is actually the one in charge of the raids, leader of the FBI later on. We'll talk about that later when we get to the 60s. But these are known as the Palmer raids. Okay, so what are they raiding? They're raiding the offices of labor leaders. Okay, the offices of labor leaders, because if they could take out the leadership of these unions, well, then those unions are going to be weakened greatly. Okay, so this is all part of the Red Scare, this fear of communism spreading in the United States, right? So you have a number of labor leaders arrested. A lot of them aren't even charged with anything specifically; they're just arresting them, and so that's illegal up to a certain point. Eventually, they have to release them. Right? You have also some immigrants who were considered troublemakers and were activists. They get deported from the country. The Socialist Party, talk about the Socialist Party, falls apart. Okay, around this time, because there's just so much scrutiny on the Socialist Party because of the Red Scare. So these are some of the reactions from the Russian Revolution in the United States after the war. Okay, so let's get back to the end of World War I. All right, so after Lenin puts out this information about the secret treaties on how the Allies were going to divide up the territory of the Central Powers once they win the war, Wilson's got to do something. President Woodrow Wilson's got to do something, right? And so he releases the 14 points to make it seem like there are moral intentions with the U.S. getting involved in this war, right? They're trying to do the right thing, right? And so Wilson puts out the 14 points. Now, these are 14 points that he would like to see implemented after World War I, but just keep in mind, this is only Wilson supporting these 14 points, and we're not going to go over all the points. European countries, they didn't really sign off on the 14 points, like France and Britain. It's an American thing, right? And so it's just his ideology trying to give moral justification for World War I. That's the point. Okay, so what are the 14 points? Well, within the 14 points, you see talk about self-determination, right? Where countries have the right to govern themselves, right? Particularly for colonized people, right? Because remember, the European empires have colonies all over the world at this time. And so Wilson's talking about, we're fighting for self-determination. That's what the war is about. Countries have a right, different, large ethnic groups around the world have a right to govern themselves in their own country, right? That's self-determination, self-governance, right? So that's one of the points. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. He's also supporting free trade. He wants free trade around the world, right? That's good because he believes in American economic power. He wants American products going around the world, right? That's his internationalism, okay? He is also talking about the ability to freely trade on the seas without getting caught up in some war, like the United States just did, right? With the sinking of the Lusitania, right? He's also talking about the creation of some kind of world organization. World organization where countries from around the world will have members in this organization, and the point of this organization is to prevent another world war from occurring, because we have to stop future wars from happening, right? This is horrible. All these people died. This will eventually get implemented, and it's going to be known as the League of Nations. Okay, later on we'll have another world organization, the United Nations, being formed. Right, so this is the beginning of having these world organizations. So these are all ideas that Wilson's throwing around in his 14 points. Okay, now eventually the war is going to come to an end. The addition of American forces is totally going to turn the tide of the war. Now you have this huge American force coming in. And whereas Germany was, knocking on the door of Paris, about to take over France, now the Americans get involved and they begin to push the Germans back. And now you have this huge Allied counteroffensive going against the German army. Okay, and so eventually the Americans and their allies are going to force Germany to surrender. Right, the German Kaiser is going to even give up the throne. All right, he's going to say, all right, I'm not Kaiser anymore, I resign, and eventually the German government is going to surrender. This is on November 11th, 1918, when Germany officially surrenders and the war is over at that point. Okay, and so that's at the end of 1918. As we move into the next year, there's going to be the signing of the treaty that officially ends the war, and there's going to be terms within this treaty. Let's talk about the terms really quick. So in the Treaty of Versailles, you're going to have Germany being forced to accept blame for starting World War I. It's all Germany's fault, right? Is it really Germany's fault? Well, it's debatable, but it's going to have an impact, because now that Germany has to accept responsibility for the war, that's going to open the door for people like Adolf Hitler later on, who are going to criticize the Treaty of Versailles. We were, falsely accused of starting the war. We had to accept blame, but it wasn't our fault. So that's one aspect of the Treaty of Versailles that's going to have some consequences. Anyhow, Germany also has to pay extremely high reparations to the countries that were involved in the war that were damaged. So basically, reparations, it's like money. You got to pay payments now to Britain, to France, etc. Right? And so that's going to hurt the German economy. Again, setting the stage for World War II. Because of that hurt economy, you have the door open for people like Adolf Hitler, who's trying to revive Germany, and people get behind him. There we go. The League of Nations, it's going to actually be created, right? So something from the 14 points really happens. So yeah, even though the League of Nations was created, it's a part of the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. Congress never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles, so the U.S. never actually joins the League of Nations, even though it was President Wilson's idea. Congress was like, look, we don't want to get involved in any more international wars or problems. We just want to kind of stick to our own, develop ourselves, and have influence in the Western Hemisphere. So Congress doesn't ratify the treaty, right? But other nations of the world do join the League of Nations, and it's a thing for a period of time. In terms of territory changes, Europe is going to look different after the Treaty of Versailles. So let's take a look at this before and after. So this right here, this map on the left is before the war. And you see you got the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Germany. These are all the Central Powers, Bulgaria as well. But after the war, you're going to see that issue of self-determination come up, where there's a number of independent nations that are going to be coming out of those old empires. countries. Okay, so Austro-Hungary is broken up into several different independent countries, and also countries that were formerly a part of Russia are going to gain their independence as well. Okay, because even though Russia was part of the Allies at first, when they pulled out, they were not invited to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles or the negotiations. All right, and one more thing on self-determination. So because there's all this talk of self-determination, President Wilson supports it. You have a number of colonized countries around the world who are calling for self-determination, right? It's like, yeah, we want that. We want to be independent. We don't want these European powers controlling our countries and natural resources anymore, right? So there's countries in Africa, Asia, the Middle East who want to gain their independence, but it's not going to happen just yet. The powerful empires of Europe are not going to give up control of their colonies just yet. Britain, France, they still have colonies all over the world. And so a lot of countries are not going to gain that self-determination yet, but the seed has been planted, and you're going to see many nationalist movements eventually rising up, calling for self-determination in the future.